Elise Marie Pollard, a 15-year-old teenager, was murdered back in 1995 in Arroyo Grande, California. The perpetrators of this crime were Jacob DeLashmoth, Joseph Fiorella, and Royce Casey, all of them also teenagers at that time. The three shared an interest in death metal music, particularly in the band Morbid Angel, and claimed that they committed this murder as an act of satanic sacrifice, which, according to them, would bring fame to the band they were part of. Elise Pollard was born on May 24, 1977, and was a student at Arroyo Grande High School. The case began to unfold when Elise disappeared on July 26, 1995. Her parents, Ed and Laurette Pollard, reported her disappearance to the local authorities. That day, the girl was last seen leaving her house in Arroyo Grande to meet up with some friends. After not returning home, her parents became worried and filed a report at the police station to notify her disappearance. What they didn't know was the hell that the poor teenager had suffered. That day, Jacob, Joseph, and Royce Casey had agreed to meet with Elise and smoke weed together in happiness, but she didn't know the real intentions behind the boys. She didn't know it, but she had become the perfect victim to carry out a horrible plan. The three young men subdued her, cut off her breath, attacked her with a sharp weapon, and took advantage of her on multiple occasions. In the words of the forensic scientist, despite being attacked in the neck, she did not die immediately, but in a slow and painful way until they killed her. All this for the spilling of blood. One of the perpetrators, in fact, recalls that the poor girl was begging God to save her, while also crying out for help and shouting her mother's name as he committed this horrible crime. When she tragically passed away, it felt like the world was ending. However, her abusers were not done with her yet. The three boys continued to take advantage of her on multiple occasions, or well, of her corpse. Even days after carrying out this event, they returned to the place to repeat this act of abuse with the obviously lifeless body of the poor teenager, until one day they finally decided to burn it so that there would be no evidence to discover them. In the following days, the three boys carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened, while a search was conducted for the poor teenager, and it wasn't until one of the perpetrators, Boyce, became a Christian and confessed the crime he had committed with his friends. The young man led the police to the crime scene, and they corroborated his version of the events, and the young girl's body was finally able to rest. The three accused, Jacob, Joseph, and Casey, were arrested and brought to trial for the murder of this teenager, Elise Pollard. During the trial, evidence was presented that supported Casey's confession, including details of the crime and the active participation of the three in Satanism. On the other hand, the prosecutor argued that the murder was carried out as part of a satanic ritual, although some questioned the validity of this information. They suggested that the defendants might have used Satanism as a kind of excuse to cover up a crime that had been planned to practice the intimacy with a lifeless body. That's a word, but I can't tell you. In turn, in their defense, the defendants commented that they needed to perform the sacrifice for the devil, and Jacob and Joseph declared themselves innocent according to their version of the events, and that the music of the thrash metal band Slayer had supposedly influenced them. For their part, the victims' parents alleged that Slayer's songs, Post-Mortem and Dead Skin Mask, had given the three killers detailed instructions to, in their words, stalk, abuse, cause suffering, murder, and commit acts of intimacy with a lifeless body. This with their daughter. The parents originally filed a lawsuit in 1996, but it had to be delayed until 2000 once the trial against the perpetrators had concluded. The three culprits were in turn found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in 1998. Jacob and Joseph were sentenced to life imprisonment, while Royce received a 26-year prison sentence. In turn, one of the perpetrators, Jacob, stated the following in a magazine in the Washington Post. "The music is destructive, but that's not why Elise was killed. She was killed because Joe was obsessed with her and obsessed with killing her." On the other hand, in July 2021, Royce Casey was denied parole. Joseph was also denied in the year 2022, and Jacob has one scheduled for the following year 2024, but it will surely have the same end. It will be denied. For its part, the case of this teenager has left an indelible mark on the memory of the community and has led to a greater awareness of the potential dangers of manipulating vulnerable youth in extremist environments. In addition, it has sparked debate about freedom of speech, the influence of the media, and the need to pay attention to warning signs in the behavior of young people. The tragedy has also led to a greater inquiry into cases involving alleged satanic rituals, with some critics arguing that the connection with Satanism and religion is sometimes exaggerated, using it as a very convenient excuse to justify such a brutal act. On September 19, 1972, a resident of Springfield, New Jersey, hears his dog scratching at the door of his apartment. The pet needs to go do its business, so he lets it out. After a while, the owner of that dog hears it scratches again. It's back home knocking on the door. Upon opening the entrance to his home, what he finds leaves him totally in shock. The Bundesena nausea is something out of a nightmare. His beloved Khan is carrying a decomposing human arm in his mouth. The resident of that apartment immediately calls the authorities of Springfield Municipality to investigate the chilling discovery. Recently, in this quiet area of Union County, a mysterious disappearance occurred. No one knows the whereabouts of the teenager Janet de Palma. The search notices are still posted on every pole in the town since 6 weeks ago, when the young girl disappeared without a trace. The general consensus to the disturbing discovery is that the female arm found could belong to the innocent missing girl. The search is focused in that area, inspecting every corner among the dense vegetation. The hounds from the Ocean County Police Department sniff the ground in search of the origin of the human arm. After a while, the investigators locate human remains on a cliff called Devil's Teeth, or, in Spanish, the teeth of the devil. The body is completely unrecognizable due to its advanced state of decay. However, as it is missing the right arm, there is no doubt that it came from there, as found by the dog. The tissue is so decomposed that they must resort to dental records to identify the victim of this tragic death. Unfortunately, it is Janet de Palma. No one can explain how the woman came to this tragic end. The investigation of a disappearance could actually be a possible homicide case. The agents are striving to trace the known path of the young woman from the last time she was seen alive, that August 7th, 1972. That Monday the 7th, when she leaves home to visit a friend before going to work, Janet tells her mother that she will hitch a ride on the way to the train station to board it and get to that friend's house. Although nowadays asking for a ride from strangers is a practice, let's say, uncommon and quite dangerous, especially in this country. In the 70s, in those areas of the North American country, it was something usual. Regrettably, the young lady from Palma didn't reach her destination. Just 4 days after her 16th birthday, Janet disappeared without leaving a single clue. For 6 weeks, the population of the municipality sympathizes with the cause and helps in the search, unfortunately without success. People knew the teenager as a kind girl and very devoted to her Christian faith. Her brothers and her parents, Salvatore and Florence, went with her to church every Sunday without fail. Her reputation was impeccable. One could say she was a saint, which makes the context in which her body was found even more disturbing. Several witnesses at the crime scene mentioned that Janet was found surrounded by objects related to occultism and that her remains lay on a pentagram. However, not all police officers agree with this statement. Donald Schvelt, one of the first officers to arrive at the scene, mentions that there is nothing unusual and even denies that it is a homicide. According to him, Janet overdosed and her friends left her there. Even in our times, unfortunately, these types of contradictory and unfounded statements continue to hinder investigations, creating a media circus. The theory that young Janet de Palma died due to not measuring her consumption of illegal substances does not match at all with her personality or her convictions. Then, an anonymous source from within the police department itself reveals that the rumors of occult activity discovered at the crime scene were actually true. An autopsy is carried out, but given the advanced state of decomposition of the remains, the exact cause of death cannot be determined. There are no signs of illegal substance use in his body, and no consumption items such as syringes or the like were found in the area. There are no signs of stabbing or gunshot wounds or a broken bone, although an inexplicably high lead content was identified in his tissue. The forensic doctor rules out options and suggests a possible case of strangulation. So without a doubt, the incident is considered a homicide. Samples of Janet's clothing are sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a more in-depth analysis. According to the report from the agency's forensic laboratory, officers analyzed her blouse, pants, and underwear, as well as the soil from the area where the body was found. The chemical and microscopic study did not reveal a single hair from another person in the samples. No substances or wine were found either. However, it was impossible to identify the origin of some stains found on her blouse, bra, and pants. They were too decomposed to test for blood and sperm. Someone surely was with her because she was wearing sandals. I was wearing mountain boots and still struggled to climb that small hill where she was lying. Officer Donnan said this: "Continuing with the investigation, the agents issue an alert to locate a homeless man nicknamed Red, who frequents this area. Upon finding him, they identify him as a possible suspect, but after a few questions, he is absolved of all suspicion. The case does not progress, they fail to locate the culprit, and the population begins to get restless." On September 29th, a newspaper shares information that was not yet known by the entire public, generating more concern, which said the following: "The investigation into the death of Janet de Palma, 16, is focusing on elements of black magic and Satan worship. According to some reports, upon reviewing the photos of the scene, authorities are beginning to believe that the girl's death could have been part of a sacrifice. As I tell you, this is what the local newspapers say. They also add pieces of wood that at first seemed to be at the scene by mere chance are now interpreted as symbols. One of the officers said that 2 pieces of wood crossed on the ground above her head. More wood surrounded the body like a coffin. Another person who was there said, 'I suppose if you were looking for signs there, local newspapers.' On the other hand, when this information is revealed, publicity about the matter, about the case, increases. It is also said that several stones were arranged around her head like a halo. Even mention is made of animal corpses placed in that area. The idea of a human sacrifice then begins to take relevance, not only because of these alarming statements, but also because of the name of the place where the body was found, the Devil's Teeth. The case of the young woman from Palma continues to generate scandal in the area, especially because it occurred just 3 years after the horrible Manson family murders. The residents of Union County fear that there may be some kind of satanic cult or witches in the vicinity. They believe that Janet became their target because of her role and frequent participation in the Christian community. According to her parents, she was someone who tried to lead others towards Jesus, also volunteered helping ex-addicts, and planned to attend Bible college. According to a report from the local newspaper, several sacrifices involving dead animals were reported near the Washington Reserve, just under 2 miles from where the body was found. It is said that in that park the officers found lit candles, a bowl with blood, feathers, and pigeons with broken necks. Courier News separately published another article in which it was reported that Union County officers allegedly brought a witch to the scene, hoping that with her experience, she could make sense of what was found in that place. "I never knew if the witch found anything," says the family's pastor, Reverend James Tate, "but I know she was there at the scene." Over time, and with the lack of clues, the case cools down and gradually becomes an urban legend. For years, it is forgotten, until in the late 90s, New Jersey Magazine receives a letter from a reader urging them to investigate that forgotten crime. When the magazine's editors begin to delve into the case and the inexplicable death, they immediately run into an obstacle. The local police resist providing the investigation files, claiming that all evidence and documents related to this De Palma incident were destroyed during the flood caused by Hurricane Floyd in 1999. It is later discovered that this was completely false. After more than 2 decades of searching and rejections by the prosecutors in turn, a copy of the case file is sent to the magazine in February 2021. The documents include images and diagrams that the agents had declared lost, surprisingly contrary to what some officers had declared. Officer Donald, contrary to what some officers had declared, Officer Donald, the one I was telling you about earlier, believes the rumor started when other agents were called by radio and and began to climb the hill. One of them noticed a rock or small stones around his head and made the comment that they looked like satanic things. This last thing was said by Officer Donald. On the other hand, a notable piece of information that was rescued from the file is about the contents of Janet's bag and the absence of the young woman's remains. A pack of tissues and other items to treat a slight cold she was suffering from that day were found, as well as a comb, a key, and an eyeshadow. However, the bag was never recovered, nor her wallet or the money she was carrying, as apparently the young woman's killer took all her valuable belongings, including her crucifix. These revelations probably resolve some doubts, but other questions arise. Looking at all the photographs of the scene, it is strange that the same officers promoted the idea of the occult ritual to the point of bringing a witch to the place, as none of the satanic signs mentioned in the rumors are seen. Another disturbing point is the police department's statement that the file was destroyed during the flood by the hurricane, as obviously this is also not true. Unfortunately, Janet's family never found the answers they so desperately needed to reach some kind of resolution. Her parents and siblings kept a relatively low profile during the investigation, and when the case went cold, they were not heard from again. Her nephew, Ray Sajewski, on the other hand, made an effort to find his aunt, but I feel sad for my family. This affected my mother and her sisters. She was their little sister, and it affected them the most. Ray still hopes that someone with information about his aunt's death will have the courage to share any information with the police so that his family can finally find justice. I don't think it's too late, says the nephew of the deceased. Besides, he comments that even older cases than this one have been solved. It would be surprising if some new finding or testimony helped to find a culprit if he is still alive, although the case file that was recently made public indicates that there was no type of occult activity. Only those who were there in the last moments of the young and innocent Janet De Palma case, better known as the Acid King, is such case, better known as the Acid King, is perhaps one of the most macabre and controversial stories that marked the beginning of the 80s decade, where satanic panic abounded and people believed they were near the end of times, as they thought the Antichrist would arrive soon. But what does this have to do with Ricky Casso? The case that I come to tell you today is about this man who reached the ears of the whole world and caused terror when the media reported the events that a young man of only 17 years old had done. In the news, it was heard how he had taken the life of a colleague to offer it in a satanic ritual. Many were horrified when they saw this man smile on television as he showed no sign of remorse. Richard Alan Casso Jr. was born on March 29, 1967 in the state of New York in a small and normal family. His mother was a teacher, while his father worked training the football team at Cold Spring School. Ricky's parents strived to give him all the education and love a child needed to grow up well. They weren't upper class, but sometimes they could afford, let's say, certain luxuries that a typical American family had. They had given him a good childhood, but none of these had helped as he began to show various psychopathic traits from a young age. At school, all his classmates thought he was weird because his conversations were somewhat disturbing. The teachers didn't know what was too strange. He did everything to maintain a profile that was too strange. He did everything to keep a low profile but always got into trouble. At 13 years old, he found a hobby that kept him busy at all hours. His parents noticed that he loved watching soccer games, so they decided to put him on his father's team so he could start socializing with other people and adapt to society. He was quite a good friend. The problem he sometimes had was that his father demanded more from him than the other team members. He began to get a bit frustrated as he felt that his father was ruining something he loved. There were times when the arguments were stronger, and there were occasions where, after a confrontation, the son would run away from home and sleep in the porches or cars of his friends. He would return 3 days later, but realized that everything was the same. His father's yelling never ceased, and he never had the support of his mother. That's why he decided to give up his favorite sport and leave his house as soon as possible. He stopped caring about his vagabond life and lack of family. He began to sleep on the streets, squares, and bridges. Sometimes his friends would invite him to spend the night at their houses and feed him, trying in some way to convince him to return home. None of this worked, and Ricky's situation kept getting worse. He started hanging out with people who also didn't have a home. They would go to forests or very dark areas and smoke this little happiness herb. Then he saw that the natural stuff was not enough for him and decided to start trying other substances like lysergic acid, diethylamide, and other types of hallucinogens he could get. It was very easy to get them at that time, since in the 80s there were plenty of people who consumed this very normally. Some used it as something medicinal, others did it as a way to escape from reality, just like Ricky did. In that decade, it was also believed that listening to metal or rock bands was synonymous with Satanism, and just all this kind of music like, say, AC/DC or Black Sabbath were bands that Ricky loved to listen to. Thanks to this taste, he also met many people who were fascinated by this musical genre, but they were also blinded by the belief that the images these bands showed were indeed a reference to occultism, and they as followers had to put into practice rebellion, black magic, illegal substances, and clearly satanic cults. Just 3 years after leaving his parents' house, Ricky had become a total rebel. He was so deep into the world of illegal substances that at 17 his face looked haggard. Sometimes the only thing he would ingest for several days was alcohol and these toxic substances. He had to rob people to get some money, and sometimes he just did it as a fun pastime. These same friends were the ones who introduced him to the world of Satanism. He felt that he finally fit into a group with this, and that this time no one was going to ruin it. He underwent several tests so that he could be in the cult of the Knights of the Black Circle. It is known that Satanism is actually a religion, but like all of these, it also has several derivatives such as traditional or theistic or atheistic, but the culture that Ricky had joined was the branch of acid Satanism. This is one of the most, let's say, chaotic and heavy in the branch of Satanism. It is one of the, besides, most known for being too stereotyped, since the people who are involved have rebellious characteristics, use inverted crosses, pentacles, use the number 666 a lot, and have a strong connection with illicit substances because these help them to have visions to communicate with their deity. These groups are made up of between 10 or 20 people between 15 and 25 years old, and the most shocking thing about this culture were the sacrifices of people that had to be made to obtain the protection of Satan of the Chamuco. But Ricky was not yet prepared to do this kind of things because he had not yet realized the situation he had gotten himself into. The young man occasionally joined activities such as desecrating graves to use the bones of the deceased in rituals, attending pagan celebrations, and the Satanic Church to listen to the writings of the Satanic Bible. This had already become part of his personality. He proudly said that he belonged to this cult and often quoted phrases from the famous Anton LaVey, creator of the Satanic Church, which, by the way, I already have a video of this if you want to go check it out. Well, he indulged in illegal substances and even said that he really used them to communicate with the one down below. He also said that in various visions and dreams the demons spoke to him. He always arrived enthusiastically to tell his school friends how enchanted he was with this new life and belonging to this culture, but instead, his classmates only saw this guy getting crazier and crazier. He kept telling them that the previous night he had gone to a party with the members of the Black Circle Knights at the infamous Amityville house, the building where the DeFeo family massacre occurred. If you want to know more about this case, I have a video discussing this terrifying place in more depth. And that way you can get more context as to why it was so important for them to perform a ritual in this area. But returning to Ricky's story, he was just bragging about what he had done and seen that night, but his colleagues were tired and a bit worried at the same time about this guy's situation, so they decided to talk to his parents and give them the exact location so they could do as he was still a minor, Ricky's parents. Since he was still a minor, Ricky's parents were able to admit him to the Amityville Psychiatric Hospital. During his stay, he openly claimed to be a member of a satanic cult and shouted that he was a worshiper of the devil. Sometimes he only did it to instill fear in the other patients. Other times he would talk calmly about it because he was actually proud to be part of that cult. The specialists then began to medicate him and would lock him up for several days so that he would not have contact with anyone. This was beginning to be a real torture for Ricky, so he decided to confess that he was not actually a follower of the devil, that he only claimed to have hallucinations in order to fit in with his group of friends, and assured that if given another chance, he would catch up with school. His parents, proud of the treatment, decided to accept him back into their home, but what they didn't know was that he had said all this to manipulate the doctors and get them to let him go. Ricky kept attending the rituals. He had to confess that he denied being a follower of Satan, and as repentance, he said that he now wanted to help unearth bodies for the same rituals, bodies that were already lifeless. He had managed to do this for weeks without the police catching him, but one day while he was digging in a local colonial cemetery, the police caught him and arrested him for 24 hours. Several weeks later, Ricky was admitted to Long Island Jewish Hospital for pneumonia. While he was hospitalized here, his parents insisted that he had to receive psychiatric care, but none of the professionals could tell him if he had any psychotic or psychopathic tendencies, diagnosing that he was actually just a very associated person. Upon returning home, Ricky was upset with his parents for the 2 times they had hospitalized him. Every day he would argue with them because he insisted that he did not need medication and assured them that he was not crazy. He vented to his cult friends, but they only supported him and encouraged him to be increasingly cruel to his parents. One day, the young man's mother had come home early from work. She went upstairs looking for her son, but couldn't find him in any room. She approached the bathroom because she heard the shower water falling. She found it a bit strange that the faucet was open as well as the door, and when she entered the room, she was met with a horrifying scene. It was Ricky with bloody wrists lying on the floor. The mom approached desperately to pick him up. She started to cry and scream in desperation when suddenly her son, guess what, started to laugh out loud, showing her that it was actually ketchup on his arms. Weeks later, the police found out that Ricky was in better condition and was ready to be tried for grave desecration. The day before, he had stayed over at a friend's house, and when he returned home, his father didn't let him in. He started scolding him at the door in front of all the neighbors. He told him not to speak to his mother again or come asking for money or help. This really hurt Ricky, so much so that he finally broke down and left there never to return. Ricky continued with his life sleeping on the streets that were beyond help. By this point, he had already lost everything, and his only refuge were toxic substances. He was now known as the Acid King. He was in a point of no return filled with debts, traffic, youth rivalries, and illegal substances. Being in this place, he also met people who would sink him even further. One of them was James Troiano, an 18-year-old who had a very complicated life. His parents had abandoned him since he was little. He dropped out of school because he was very problematic. He was addicted to any hallucinogenic substance, and he was in and out of jail for minor crimes. On the other hand, there was also Gary Lewis, a 17-year-old boy who was orphaned at a very early age. He had an internal conflict because he didn't know whether to ask for help to reform and go back to school and move forward, or to stay stuck in the life he was dealt and take the illegal substance business seriously. Apparently, he liked the second option more, especially when he met Ricky, as they had a strong rivalry and were always fighting to see who was the best. The illicit substance businesses made them enemies. It made them enemies, as they only fought amongst themselves to gain more prestige on the streets and to make more money, even fiercely fighting over a piece of land. One of the biggest conflicts, however, that they had was at a pagan party that both of them attended. Ricky was so out of it and crazy that he spent the entire night passed out on a couch. Gary, on the other hand, took this opportunity to steal all of his opponent's merchandise so he could sell more. 3 days later, Ricky goes in search of the man who stole everything from him to give him what he deserves. The young man was so enraged because this incident caused him to lose customers and more than $100 in merchandise. They chatted a bit, but Ricky was becoming increasingly violent. The look in little Gary's eyes showed so much fear that James felt compassion for him and stepped into the fight to prevent anything serious from happening at that moment. Finally, Lowers returned all the money he had taken from the substances, and that's how they were able to make peace. But not for long. Ricky really wanted to be on good terms with Gary. He was thinking about truly forgiving him so that there would be no more rivalry and instead make some kind of alliance so that both would benefit. For this, he had organized a bonfire in the middle of the forest with several friends, and Gary was invited. They were heading towards the Astakia forest, where they lit a fire to illuminate their small gathering. While they were talking and getting intoxicated, Gary realized that the fire was about to go out. So he took off one of his socks and threw it into the flames to revive the bonfire. This action only caused Ricky to mock and incite the others. He said, "Why don't you burn your whole jacket?" Gary retorted, "Why don't you burn your whole jacket?" Gary, for his part, didn't want to confront him, so he continued smoking without paying him much attention. Amid the mix of substances they were consuming, the 17-year-old boy told Ricky that he thought he had invited him to the forest to take his life. But the young man just started laughing at such a statement and assured him that wouldn't happen that night. Knowing what Gary was thinking, Ricky started to tease him by giving him little punches. He played with his hair and occasionally lunged at him, pretending he was going to attack. He, referring to the victim, Gary, really felt uncomfortable. He stood up to better leave there because he had the feeling that something bad was going to happen, and well, it did. Before he could leave, James seized him from behind, insisting he stay. He strongly pressed Gary, leading to a fight. He insisted a lot on Gary. He stood up and started a fight. Ricky and Gary started hitting each other. The Acid King, being taller, was beating his opponent. The weaker one could only defend himself by biting the other's ear and neck, although in reality, this only made Ricky even angrier. He was so full of anger and adrenaline that the man pulled out a knife and started stabbing his enemy. He was almost out of strength from the wounds the knife had caused. Still, the victim tried to escape from the thugs to survive. In the middle of the forest, only 3 shadows could be seen running fiercely. Unfortunately, Gary was caught, and while James held him in his arms, Ricky continued to beat him. The 2 boys made their victim kneel, and while they made him suffer, Ricky inserted the knife into the rib and moved it slowly while saying, "Say you love Satan." Gary was so terrified by what was happening, at some point he blamed the illegal substances, but when he felt the stabbing pain in his ribs, he realized he was about to lose his life. The victim didn't listen to him. He just said, "I love my mother," which made Ricky even angrier, making the stabs even more aggressive. James moved away from where he was, still in disbelief, as he saw his friend taking another person's life. He didn't want to stop him because he was afraid that his fate would be the same or worse, so he ran away. Gary received between 17 and 36 stabs. The wounds were scattered, imagine, all over the body, from the abdomen, chest, face, and even in the eyes. It took Ricky 3 hours to take his life until he finally had no more signs of life. He covered the body with leaves and branches and left the forest as if nothing had happened. There wasn't a drop of regret in his soul. On the contrary, he spoke of that event with pride, telling his friends what had happened and inviting them to the forest to witness Garvey's body firsthand. He justified himself by saying that one night he had a vision where Satan himself appeared to him and told him he wanted a sacrifice to give him eternal life. He took his friends to the forest so they could watch him bury and hide it better. The rumors then began to spread, word of mouth about what Ricky had done. However, several weeks later, the Norfolk police received an anonymous call saying they had found a decomposing body. The officers, upon going to this indicated place, come across the regrettable and terrifying scene of a young man, no older than 16, semi-buried in the forest ground, lifeless. They counted more than 32 stab wounds. They also searched the entire place, but couldn't find any other clues. Suddenly, a person approached the police officer handling Gary's case and claimed that Ricky himself had confessed to them that he had taken Gary as a sacrifice and took his life in the middle of the forest. The witness described everything they had heard from Casso's mouth, and this matched perfectly with what they had found at the crime scene. They didn't wait a second longer, and on July 5, 1984, Ricky Casso was arrested along with his friends James Trollano and Albert Quinones. For some reason, Casso didn't want to spend his entire life in prison, perhaps out of shame or because he thought his deity would severely punish him. In July 5, 1984, he made the decision to take his own life in his cell. Many believe his death was an offering to Satan, while others say that all the sacrifices were a game that got out of hand, and upon seeing what he had done or caused, he ended up taking his own life. In other words, in short, the whole charade got out of hand. Similarly, this case has been very famous and remembered for how gloomy and terrifying it was. Many series and movies talk about this story as a tribute to the time when satanic panic was abundant. But if you like this video, or I don't know, if you would like me to tell a horror story, you can write to me on Instagram or Facebook or at my email, which is email@pepemisterio.com.mx, and see you in a new video tomorrow. Subscribe to the channel. Of a satanic and Machiavellian background impossible to believe. His character is based on a true event that shocked all the inhabitants of the city of West Memphis, this in Arkansas. And this is the true story, but don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it for you because I haven't even seen this series myself. In 1993, 3 8-year-old children were victims of the most vile and atrocious crime ever seen in the history of that city. Allegedly sacrificed in a satanic ritual, the young Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers had their lives taken in the most infamous and inhumane way possible. It all started on May 5th with the report of the 3 minors' disappearance. The first to alert the authorities was Christopher's adoptive father, John Mark Byers, who went to the police station around 7 in the evening. The initial hours when nothing was known about the children, investigations were somewhat limited by the authorities. Seeing the lack of response to find their whereabouts, neighbors and close friends started a search on their own, but they didn't find a single trace. It was on May 6, 1993, when the police discovered the most brutal of scenes, an image impossible to describe, as if hell had unleashed its fury and profaned even the soul of those 3 innocent childhoods. There they were, abandoned on Robin Hood Hill, the bodies of 3 8-year-old boys, naked, tied by their feet and hands with their shoelaces, outraged, violated, tortured, and in the case of Christopher Byers, lacerated and mutilated of his member. Angry, helpless, and desolate relatives, friends, and all the inhabitants of this community were crying out for justice. An event of such magnitude could in no way be piled up in the archived cases. A crime of this nature would never be forgotten. And with the public spirit boiling, the eyes of the city and media were on the police, who had to act quickly and above all efficiently. They had to put the perpetrator of such a barbarity behind bars. In their eagerness to end this situation as soon as possible, the officers did not carry out a thorough job to gather all possible evidence, let alone prolong the crime scene to have enough time to examine it thoroughly. On the contrary, the bodies were immediately removed from the stream even before the forensic doctor could do his job. Overwhelmed by social pressure and above all by not having a single clue pointing to the author of such a terrifying act who had been extremely careful when committing the crime, leaving the scene completely clean, without fingerprints, without deoxyribonucleic acid, without a trace of blood. The police began to take testimonies from supposed witnesses who allegedly saw something relevant on the day of the event. Due to the chilling nature of this case, conjectures began to be created, reaching a conclusion to which they would irrefutably adhere. The unleashed cruelty in that stream that took the lives of 3 8-year-old children could only have been the result of a brutal satanic sacrifice. After this, all that was left was to find someone among the inhabitants of the city of West Memphis who fit the ideal profile to investigate it, and that's how Vicky Hutchinson's statement mysteriously appeared, accusing Damien Ackles, a boy who in the eyes of the police force met the requirements to be part of a perverse cult. Vicky invited Damien to her house with the purpose of getting some confession and spreading it through a recording. However, this did not happen. Therefore, there was nothing left to claim that such tape was inaudible material. In another attempt to bring this boy to the stand, the witness's son named Aaron was involved, friend and playmate of the children deprived of life. He said he had witnessed strange things that day in the forest, but his argument lacked consistency and was dismissed. Later, from one second to another, without foundations or solid basis from which to presume, Jesse Miskelly was called to testify, a 17-year-old boy with a low IQ. Then suddenly, the K-8 news broadcast came on air with the following scoop.
In this program,
the news program also revealed how Inspector Gitchell, through a press conference, communicated that there were extremely powerful arguments against the young accused. By that time, that place could have been compared to the stories of the witches of Ceylon, just to give you an idea, pointing at someone for their appearance and condemning them without justification. Now, with 3 alleged culprits in sight, hatred was on the surface. An uncontrollable fury was attacking the entire population with a thirst for justice and even revenge. Countless times these teenagers were threatened with death, judged and pointed out as ruthless killers, until finally Damien Ackles was linked to the crime that had shaken the city of the alleged culprits had been originated by the testimony of Jesse Miskeldy. This confession, full of inconsistencies, was extracted from a boy with an intellectual disability, interrogated for 12 hours, and forced to yield to the insinuations of the investigators. There are records stating that he was questioned about 8 times about the time the victims' deaths occurred, causing him extreme confusion, as after Detective Rich asked him the question of when did you go with them, and he answered in the morning, a quite questionable interrogation ensued, each question making him change the schedule a bit until reaching the indicated moment. In fact, in other words, the detective was asking him what he wanted to hear, that with a fragment recorded in audio. There is no video with a fragment recorded in audio. There is no video to back it up, and there was no other significant discovery in the case beyond what the police already had. Such a vile and premeditated act like this could not have been carried out by a single person. At least 3 were needed, and these boys were the perfect target, completely accepted by an angry society, and above all, believing that there were devilish veneration in their community. Jesse ended up incriminating himself and put a lot of pressure on the investigators. We had to find someone to blame.
This into motion before people started losing their jobs. The public
Was
terrified we'd persist with the incapable police. They couldn't do their jobs, so we couldn't do anything quickly. And with a clear choice as we halted from...
everyone...
But it worked, devastating the entire town, then continued to... prosecute Miss Kelly, who...
was sentenced to life imprisonment even, and dense and the deficient investigations that were carried out in the case from the beginning, it was only left to find a minimum detail to put them behind bars. Eager to initiate closure then, in this violent chapter that ravaged the entire town, they proceeded to prosecute Miss Kelly, who was sentenced to life imprisonment even when her statements did not match the facts at all. A false statement expert, Dr. Richard, was present at the trial and testified that this whole setup was a classic example of police coercion. Now, all that was left was to go after the head of who had been decided would be the leader and essential author of the crime, Damien Eccles, with the help of his best friend Jason Baldwin. But what made him become considered as the main suspect? His personality, clothing, reading preferences, and his favorite music, heavy metal. These tastes, frowned upon by people at that time, led him to be labeled as a Satanist. This boy was born on December 11, 1974, with the name Michael Wayne Hutchinson. He was a child with a complicated childhood amidst economic difficulties, constant moves, and witness to the repeated arguments that took place in his home. At just 8 years old, he experienced his family's separation. His parents divorced and he had to move again. At 13, he and his mother moved to West Memphis, Arkansas in the northern United States. His mother met Jack Eccles, who joined the small family, and was welcomed with open arms as he knew the decision to change his name to Damien Wayne Eccles. The decision to change his name to Damien Wayne Eccles, adopting the surname of his now stepfather. However, this period of tranquility was interrupted during the transition from teenager to adult. This man, in the prime of his rebellion, dropped out of school and started getting into trouble with minors, thus attracting the attention and contempt of the police. At some point in his life, he also had to be admitted to a mental health institution due to a series of complications that led him to be diagnosed with conditions that altered his emotional stability. As if all these traits were not enough, it was added the fact that he was not such a common boy. His preference for certain things that were considered strange was well known. His particular preference for almost always wearing the color black. His fondness for reading terrifying topics from authors, among which Stephen King stood out. The interest in the pagan religion, Wicca, characterized by its followers' belief in a female deity and also allegedly linked to witchcraft. None of Eccles' hobbies categorized him within the standards of a so-called normal person of those times, let alone the fanaticism for heavy metal, including bands like Blue Oyster Cult, Metallica, Pink Floyd, among others of this kind. Knowing all these traits of the boy's personality, the day the 3 murders occurred, the police thought Damien Eccles finally killed someone, basically pointing him out and judging him for his way of being. The story that had to be told from now on had to portray this boy and his friend Jason, claimed to have been in there.
Respective.
Holmes, his friend Jason, claimed to have been in their respective homes on the day of the crimes. They had an alibi indicating their innocence, but the paranoia of the people, blind to the pain, weighed more than the non-existent evidence that could assertively point to these teenagers as guilty. There was even a very important event that was left out of the case, which might involve the real culprit, but it was not investigated or probed much further. Going back to the night the children disappeared, an incident at the Bojangles restaurant was reported to the police. The manager of this place testified that around 9:30 at night, he found a black man sitting in the women's restroom. He was bleeding from the forearm, had mud on his feet, and seemed somewhat confused when questioned about his appearance. Despite this fact being reported to the West Memphis police, there was no report, no statement, no investigation into it. Evidence was collected until May 6, but it was never analyzed and was considered lost. going through a notably influenced trial, as I tell you again, by simple slander and defamation based on personal tastes such as music, reading, and the way of dressing, dictated as a verdict on March 19, 94, guilty Demian Eccles, sentenced to death by lethal injection, considered the leader and author of the crime, and Jason Baldwin, sentenced to life imprisonment. During the following decades, after several attempts at appeal pointing out the mistakes that had been made during the investigation, attention was drawn to the stepfather of one of the victims, John Mark Byers. He had in his possession a knife with his stepson's blood on it. This man was questioned, but no conclusion was reached. It wasn't until the year 2003 when Vicky Hutchinson recanted her statements given years ago. She claimed they had been dictated by the police word for word. 4 years later, in 2007, deoxyribonucleic acid evidence was found that completely disproved the guilt of the 3 accused boys. After so much controversy and new evidence in favor, it was achieved that the sentences of the now known as the West Memphis 3 could be reevaluated. Finally, the long-awaited day came when true justice would be served. On August 19, 2011, this trio was released from their sentences. Subsequently, Governor Mike offered them a full pardon. Currently, suspicions have been raised regarding Terry Hobbs, stepfather of one of the victims, as new evidence claims to have found his deoxyribonucleic acid on one of the shoelaces used to tie the children. In 2013, 2 men reported having certain information linking him to the crime. However, these statements were ignored. Damon Eccles managed to reconstruct his life. He became a writer, publishing his autobiography, which is called Almost Home. He also wrote songs for the well-known band Pearl Jam. He worked with filmmaker Peter Jackson and documentarian Amy J. Burke on the movie West of Memphis. And this was the tragic story that inspired the character of Eddie Munson in Stranger Things, played by Joseph Quinn, which has caused, a great impact and has once again put the case of the whereabouts of the real culprit, murderer of 3 innocent children, back into the spotlight. A brutal femicide in Brazil led the local police in Mogiwaku to believe it was a crime related to a satanic ritual. Due to the victim's activity and the scene itself, which left the body of a young pregnant woman with a huge hole in her stomach, her baby had been taken from her and her body lay mutilated in several parts. This is the story of Ohana, a single mother who found herself needing to resort to witchcraft in order to fill the void she felt when the father of her children left, as well as the difficult economic situation she was going through. Ohana Caroline, 24 years old, was originally from the municipality of Mogiwaku, in the state located in the south of Brazil, São Paulo, where she also lived and had spent practically her entire life. Apparently, the young woman was a single mother of 3 small children and was expecting one more. As she was 7 months pregnant, she was about to give birth. Her big belly said it all by itself. Not long ago, on the other hand, she had separated from the father of her children due to problems in the relationship that fortunately did not end badly on either side, with lawsuits, violence, or much worse, death. Ohana, as a result of a deep depression and sadness for being left alone, having to take care of a whole family almost by herself, began to resort to places where she practiced Santeria. She believed they could help her and tell her what to do. She hoped her future would not be as bitter as her present and wanted to confirm it through card and palm divination, which was going to be even worse. The girl went to all kinds of places and started to have other kinds of friends who were also involved in the same thing, in a kind of macumba rituals. So her close relatives and friends decided to step aside and not be part of what Caroline was doing with her life. Those who were close to her said she was now part of satanic rites and witchcraft. She was seen carrying strange objects with foul smells and frequenting seedy places in her locality. She completely neglected her children and was about to lose custody of them to her ex-husband, who was indeed looking after their little ones, at least more than his ex-partner, as he anyway lived as if he had no offspring from the moment he abandoned them. The social circle that had distanced itself from Ohana feared the worst. They thought she could hurt someone or someone could hurt her, as the rituals were becoming increasingly intense. More with these fanatics. Strange things started to happen. Even more so with these fanatics. Strange things started to happen both in her life and in the lives of her loved ones. It came to the point where an intervention was needed to talk to her and tell her that there was still time to leave all those things related to the Satanic. She could start by attending church or Christian centers where she could heal her life and the traumas she had since she was little and that now tormented her, being an adult. Besides, she was still about to remedy the neglect to her little ones and be a good mom, the one her children at least expected or deserved her to be for a moment. She regained her senses and chose to follow her family and friends' advice. She abruptly abandoned witchcraft. She stopped attending the places where they practiced the rituals and stopped performing them at her home. Everything had returned to normal, or so it seemed. For they say that you can leave witchcraft, but it can't leave you. On the afternoon of a Wednesday, September 21st of the year 2022, on the afternoon of a Wednesday, September 21 of the year 2022, when the young woman went out on an errand. She planned to buy fruits and meat for her children at a supermarket near her home, and she didn't expect to be more than about 30 minutes. She returned, and her mother, who helped her take care of her children for a while in the afternoons, helped her make the food. However, the pregnant mother of 3 small children relapsed, so to speak, and left her house at midnight heading for another ritual. They had contacted her when she went out to do the shopping, and she agreed. Once she got into a black car, according to some witnesses, she never returned. A missing person report was filed, but there wasn't much need to search. Ohana's body was discovered by people walking in the morning on the streets of Mogiwaku. The cult had abandoned what was left of the woman in an area surrounded by evangelical churches, perhaps alluding to what Caroline intended to do, completely abandon the satanic life and become a Christian. Somehow they had found out they had eyes and ears everywhere. It seemed like they had spied on the woman. The corresponding authorities arrived at the place located in Portal dos Lagos, who, without hesitation, cordoned off the crime scene to start the investigations, of which they had what they supposed. It was a witchcraft ritual. They called an emergency contact of the victim, and her ex-husband came to the place just to confirm that it was the mother of his children. The body, or what was left of it, had its noble parts completely torn, and her stomach was totally open. The baby that was once inside was no longer visible. Only a huge hole where there was once life about to be born could be noticed. Only a shirt covered her breasts, but everything else was very explicit and terrifying. Near the body, there was only a pair of shorts, a pair of sandals, and money, which were collected and taken to be analyzed in a laboratory in search of any trace belonging to a criminal. The incident is obviously still causing shock in Brazil, as so far no one has been found responsible for such a level of savagery belonging to a being completely out of this world, as not even animals are capable of committing such abhorrent acts. A witchcraft ritual remains the main line of investigation for the Brazilian police, who so far have not managed to even find the name of the sect or locate the famous vehicle in which Caroline allegedly got in and was last seen. For now, the 3 little ones will simply have to return to their father who once abandoned them, hoping for justice for the mother they lost to brutal murder.